Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 146 of Gone But Never Forgotten. Also, the second episode that I can say I'm lucky enough to have Bailey with me in the co-pilot chair. Hello, Bailey, and welcome back to the show.
Hey, Lance and the GBNF crew. Thanks for having me back on another episode. It's insane to think about how many serial killers there are that we could cover. It also seems to never end. I'm excited to be back and ready to get into the madness again.
It seems that we've started a little bit of a tradition now when we work together on these things, as we do our second case together and now cover our second serial killer case. This week we're honing in on the Route 40 killer, the only known serial killer to this day in the state of Delaware's history. Let's jump right in, shall we?
You're right. There definitely seems to be some sort of tradition so far with our episodes. Both episodes I've now been a part of contain some pretty gruesome attacks and brutality towards women. This serial killer has a similar style to the last episode I covered with you. But you're right, here we are. And as Lance mentioned, the state of Delaware was certainly not known for its serial killers. And this case originally did not start off as being a serial killer case, likely because of that reason. Authorities in the state didn't often have to look at multiple slayings and see connections. The first victim in this case would be discovered on November 30th, 1987. Her name was Shirley Ellis. Shirley was born to her mother, Nancy. She also had a sister named Nancy, but we couldn't find really any information on her father or anyone else in her family, really. Shirley at the time was a 23-year-old, and was described by people who knew her as a sweet, kind person who would literally go above and beyond to do anything for anyone that was in need. She was a bleeding heart.
Sadly, as we see way too often in our true crime cases, that would ultimately wind up being her downfall. On November 30th, she was leaving home to head towards the Wilmington Hospital around 6 p.m. to bring leftover Thanksgiving food to a patient at the hospital who she had befriended, and that she didn't want to be left out of the holiday season with Thanksgiving having just passed. The walk was a 14-mile walk, and with it being a chilly and rainy night, Shirley made the decision that she would walk along Route 40 because she was hoping that she would garner a ride. Shirley was not unfamiliar with walking along Route 40. Part of the reason that she was a bleeding heart was because she herself had been through her fair share of tough times, and she had walked that corridor at times when she had worked previously as a street worker. Her family remembers the tough times well, saying that as Shirley grew up, she started to run away from home, and they had gone through longer patches of worrying about her and were absolutely ecstatic when she stopped running away, returned home, and started to realign her life.
Shirley was planning to use all of her skills of helping others and her past of overcoming to truly change her life. She was preparing to start studying to become a nurse. Sadly, though, she never got to see the dream through because of this fateful night. As she walked along Route 40, she was picked up for a ride, but the person that was driving the vehicle had no intentions of driving her to the hospital, which was her destination. Instead, he had plans to torture and kill her. On November 30th, Shirley's body was discovered by two people along the roadside around 9:25 p.m., only roughly 3.5 hours after she had left her home. Shirley was still in her blue pants, and her legs were spread out, and her hands and feet were tied with black duct tape. That same duct tape had been used to keep her from screaming, and there was still remnants of that in her hair. There were no signs of sexual assault on Shirley, but she had been absolutely tortured before she was murdered. She had ligature strangulation marks around her neck, numerous skull fractures and lacerations that were consistent with being struck with a hammer. She had wrist injuries suggested of the binding that had been done to her, and she had severe bruising and damage to her left breast and left nipple.
The thing that struck me as I first started reading the case was the fact that there was seemingly no sexual assault. The person that was behind this murder and the murders that are to come seemed to be very driven by something sexual, but his desires were satiated by torture and abuse and murder rather than actual physical sexual acts. Investigators were certainly stumped by all of this. There seemed to not be any reason at all for Shirley to be targeted and killed, and so that meant that she likely had been simply picked up by a stranger. There were no angry ex-boyfriends in her past, and nobody could even direct a finger towards anyone in particular who would have had a reason to harm Shirley. The early belief in her murder was that an interstate trucker had come across her and had tortured and murdered her.
Shirley's prints were, of course, taken because there was no immediate way for her body to be identified. But her prints did not come up as a match in the database, so even IDing her appeared like it might be very difficult. Shirley did have some unique tattoos, which the investigators took photographs of and were able to circulate them within the police departments to see if anyone may recognize them. An officer was apparently the one who recognized the tattoos and mentioned her name, and it seems that was the way that she was identified. It was also determined that Shirley had not been killed where her body was found. It was very evident that she had been tortured and killed somewhere else, and then her body was dumped where it was found. Investigators, of course, appealed to the public for any tips or any leads for any information that could be found to help them narrow down who this killer could be.
The days would sadly turn into weeks, and the weeks would turn to months, and the investigation into who was responsible for the murder of Shirley did not get any closer to being closed. A killer was certainly on the loose, but investigators didn't even know at this point whether they believed that the killer was in their midst, or if that killer had simply been passing through Delaware. Then, 7 months later, on June 28th of 1988, all of that changed. On that date, Catherine DeMoro was seen walking down Route 40 at around 11:30 p.m. That would wind up being the last time that Catherine was seen alive. At 6:25 a.m. the following morning, Catherine's body would be found by construction workers. Her body was found naked, and much like Shirley, it was evident that she had been strangled and restrained. She had also been killed with a hammer, and her breasts had been tortured with a pair of pliers. Again, there were no signs of sexual assault. The only real difference that was seen on Catherine's body from what had been found on Shirley's body was that her body was covered in some kind of blue fiber.
Catherine was a 31-year-old single mom who had just divorced from her husband not too long before she was murdered. She had 2 children, and sadly, she too had a history of prostitution and arrests. Investigators found out that Catherine liked to frequent bars along Route 40, and she was also known to hitchhike along Route 40 as well. As you can imagine, investigators believed that they were looking for the same person now in the murders of Shirley and Catherine. The 2 cases were far too similar, and so the investigators on both cases quickly started to share notes and share the information they had. When police had come to the construction site where Catherine's body had been found, they noted that there were tire tracks left next to the body, and so they again determined that this was not the site where Catherine had been tortured and killed. Catherine's body was found only about 3 miles away from where Shirley's body had been found, and so it started to quickly become more and more evident that investigators were looking for a serial killer who had an MO, a hunting ground, and a home base established.
This was the point where things really ramped up. This case quickly was escalated from one solitary unsolved murder to the hunt for a serial killer. The FBI quickly came on board to help with the case, and their profiling unit painted a truly horrific picture right off the bat. They believed that they were looking for a white male who was between the ages of 25 and 35, and that he may have a job in the construction or building field, because the two bodies had been found near construction sites, and of course, because the killer had also used tools that would be familiar to those trades. Profilers believed that this was simply the beginning of his killing, likely the first two murders, and that he would not stop killing now until he was captured. It was evident that he did have an MO, as Bailey said. He did have a hunting ground along Route 40, and he knew where to find women, and he knew where to find women that he could prey on. A task force was quickly put together to end this killing spree, and it was made up of over 60 dedicated investigators, which, for point of reference, would have been the third largest police department in the state of Delaware at that time. That is how seriously this case was being taken. The task force had access to an airplane, helicopters, and rental vehicles, and investigators were told that money was not an issue. This case needed to be closed, and they were essentially operating on an unlimited budget.
If only all murder cases, and especially serial killer cases, were pursued with this level of haste from the very beginning, it would be amazing. As we have seen many times in the past cases, like this one would have been looked at as a lesser case simply because the two women at least dabbled in the realm of sex trade work. Thankfully, this wasn't the case here. A life is a life, and it is certainly nice to see a case treated as such. One of the things that investigators did was they started to send agents out along Route 40 corridor, disguised as sex trade workers. One of those agents would wind up being an absolute hero in this case, and her name is Renee Lano. She was brought in specifically to walk along Route 40 and look for any men that were frequenting the area and who pulled over to talk to her. When Renee was out along the corridor, she was closely watched to ensure her safety, and any time that a man would pull over to speak with her, their license plate was run through the system to see if there were any criminal history, and would pique the interest of the investigators. There were a couple of people of interest on the list that were uncovered along the way in this case, including a school teacher whose home was even searched in an attempt to find evidence, but he was ultimately cleared, and sadly, the investigation didn't seem to be closing in on the person responsible for the torture and murder of these two women.
Less than a month after Catherine disappeared, another woman would go missing. Her name was Margaret Lynn Finner, and she was 27 years old, and she was a known sex worker. Margaret would disappear on August 22nd of 1988. She was described as a woman who was very close with her family, and she was also known to have children. Friends said that in the lead up to her disappearance, Margaret was struggling very badly. She had started working in the sex trade because she needed and wanted to make extra money so that she could take care of her children and, of course, herself. Her family, though, did not seem to be aware of the fact that she had started to do that type of work. It was said by friends that on the night that she had disappeared, Margaret had gone out to search for clients. A number of witnesses would say that Margaret was seen on Route 40 that night, and in what would wind up being a key piece of evidence in the case, a friend of Margaret said that he had seen her getting into a blue Ford that was driven by a white male.
Armed with what they hoped was a solid lead, Renee continued to pose as a sex worker along Route 40, and she was, of course, watching in particular for a blue Ford vehicle. On September 14th, 1988, Renee noticed that a particular blue Ford had passed her at least 6 or 7 times in the span of about 20 minutes. Renee then decided to move to a more isolated area along Route 40 because she felt like in her gut that this particular vehicle was circling her, almost similar to the way a shark would circle its prey. After she moved, the blue Ford again approached and this time stopped beside her. The driver of the vehicle was a white male, and Renee quickly noticed as she leaned in the window that the carpet inside the vehicle was blue and looked a lot like the fibers that had been found on Catherine's body. As Renee leaned in, she noticed that the driver appeared to be nervous, and he didn't really make eye contact with her. But he conversed and tried to convince her to enter his vehicle nonetheless. Renee refused to get into the car, and she made up a story saying that she was tired. At one point, clearly angry, she said that the man then abruptly leaned over and pushed the car door open in an attempt to convince her to get inside, which she still didn't. She did manage, however, to lean into the car long enough to grab some of the carpet fibers while speaking to him.
While all of that was going on, another one of the investigators ran the plates on the vehicle, and they found out that the car was registered to a man named Stephen Pennell. In the conversation with Renee, the man had told her that his name was Jim, and that he was an electrician. As you can imagine, that got the minds of investigators racing, because electricians would certainly own the types of tools that had been used in the two murders. The fibers that Renee managed to grab from the carpet of the vehicle were of course sent in for testing and sent in for comparison to the fibers that were found on Catherine's body. A search warrant was also secured so that investigators could start to follow Pennell. The investigation ramped up in a massive way, but unfortunately, so did the crimes of Pennell.
Let's take a pause in the case to take a closer look at the man that was Stephen Pennell. Stephen was born November 22nd, 1957, in Delaware, and it has been said that even as a young man, he did not have a good relationship with his mother. Aside from his interactions with his mom, it was also said that as a young man, he was overall a pretty good boy. It has been said that he was shy and was timid, and that he was always helpful to the rest of his family and to neighbors. Pennell had always had a fascination with police work. He had a neighbor who was a police officer, and Pennell could always be found asking the officer questions about his day and about the work and what he did. By high school, Pennell was a large boy. He was 6 feet tall, and he was known by his classmates as the Gentle Giant. He graduated from high school in 1976, and he spent 2 years studying criminology of all things. His lifelong dream had remained to become a police officer, and he applied to the Wilmington Police Cadet Program, where he ultimately failed the physical tests to become a police officer and was unsuccessful. So, Pennell made the decision to pivot, and he became a qualified electrical technician instead in 1987, and he was a married man with 2 sons and a daughter from his wife's previous marriage. The woman that Pennell was married to was Vera Pennell. The family lived in a trailer home near Route 40 in Glasgow, Delaware, and he was known by everyone that knew him as a family man who played sports with his children and the children in the neighborhood, gave kids rides to school, and even dressed up as Santa for the children at Christmas time.
It's haunting to me when you delve into the pasts of some of these killers. We like to believe that every serial killer had a history and had signs of who they were or who they were becoming. We like to believe that there are at least warning signs of some kind. However, there are also serial killers like this guy. People who just seemed weird maybe, but nothing really stood out overall. This man was around people's children all the time, and yet nobody had a clue that the man that was spending that time with their children and with their families would wind up being a sadistic killer. Pennell was not simply some good man, though, that had an easy life and that didn't have a dark side. Rather, it appears that he just didn't let his dark side out, and those that saw it never reported him for the things that he did. As mentioned, things between he and his mother were never good, and as Pennell grew up, she was always criticizing him. She always put him down because he failed to become a police officer and because he was failing as an electrician. This relationship seemed to be a root for Pennell that could partially, at least, explain the issues that he had with women. Because he was not finding steady work as an electrician, Pennell also did odd jobs, including working as a bouncer at a club. At this point, he stood 6'5" and weighed about 300 pounds, but it was said that aside from being physically imposing, he was not a good bouncer either, because he did not command any type of respect whatsoever. During this time, he was not making money very often, and he was racking up massive debt for him and his wife, which was the cause of many fights between the two at home. It's been said that Pennell did have a history of domestic violence against Vera, even having broken her arm once. However, that assault went unreported.
It just goes to show that appearances are certainly not everything. People can very easily have a dark side, and if people do not report that dark side, things can escalate. Again, if you see something, say something.
Absolutely. This is one of those times where I really want to reiterate something that I say often on the show. If you're a victim of domestic violence, first and foremost, get out of that situation if you can. And second of all, if you are a victim, or if you know someone that is a victim, please tell someone. Please call the police. Even if you believe that nothing will be done, it's helpful to have things on a file. It's quite possible that if Pennell had previous run-ins with the police, lives here might have been saved.
And unfortunately, we are not at the end of Pennell's victims. Only 2 days after Pennell had his run-in with Renee on Route 40, a woman named Michelle Gordon would go missing. Michelle was 22 years old and was known for frequenting Route 40 and working within the sex trade. This time, witnesses very clearly said that they saw Michelle getting into a blue Ford panel car, and only 4 days later, her body was found on the rocks of the Chesapeake, Delaware Canal. Michelle was described by those who knew her as a very happy-go-lucky young woman, and it has been said that she was charming, charismatic, very kind to everyone that she met. She was the type of person who would give someone the clothing off her back if they needed it. Michelle, though, suffered from an addiction to cocaine, and when the autopsy results came back, it was determined that she had been under the influence of cocaine when she had been kidnapped, and that the cocaine had caused her heart to stop before the abuse at the hands of Pennell was even carried out, which I guess is a positive in this kind of a circumstance. Her body had been found submerged in water, so no determination could be officially made on the cause of death, but the injuries on her body were consistent with the same injuries that Shirley and Catherine had endured. The major tip for police came from a friend of Michelle's when he told police that he knew Michelle and knew Pennell and was able to identify that Pennell was behind the wheel, and he was able to identify Pennell's vehicle as well.
This was really the tip that broke the case, and Pennell came under nearly 24-hour surveillance as investigators hoped that they would catch Pennell in the act of picking up a hitchhiker. While he was being watched, they saw that Pennell would frequently leave his home in the middle of the night and go for drives along Route 40, sometimes for hours at a time. This obviously stood out to investigators because he was following the routine that they knew their serial killer would be following. There was, though, still no concrete evidence to tie Pennell to the murders. That changed, though, when the fibers that had been sent for testing came back as a complete match to the fibers that they had found on the body of Catherine. On September 23rd, one more woman would go missing. 26-year-old Kathleen Ann Meyer. An off-duty police officer had witnessed her getting into a blue Ford on Route 40 at approximately 9:30 p.m., and he was able to write down the license plate number, and that, of course, came back to the vehicle again that was owned by Stephen Pennell. Unfortunately, to this day, Kathleen's body has never been found. As evidence started to pile up, public prosecutor Charles Oberdy approved a police search warrant for the panel van that was owned by Pennell. Investigators, meanwhile, were desperately trying to find any reason they could to arrest Pennell to get him off the streets.
Pennell was finally pulled over for a routine traffic violation, and in what was a strange but legal move, he was immediately brought into the courthouse to pay his fine. This was obviously done to ensure that he was in custody and would be at least temporarily detained. While he was detained, investigators searched the vehicle and they found prints, blood, and hair that matched the victims, as well as adhesive tape that had matched the tape that had been used and found in Shirley's hair. A torture kit was also found in the van that was filled with pliers, whips, a hammer, handcuffs, needles, knives, and other restraints. When investigators later searched Pennell's home, they found multiple holes in the wall of the family home, and when they asked Vera about the holes, she said that Pennell had a habit of getting incredibly angry and of punching holes into the wall. After all of this investigation, Pennell was finally and thankfully arrested on November 29, 1988, exactly 1 year to the day from when Shirley had been murdered. Pennell was charged with 3 murders in the deaths of Shirley Ellis, Catherine DeMauro, and Michelle Gordon. When he was arrested, Pennell invoked his right to remain silent, aside from saying that he was innocent, and he requested an attorney. One of the members of the task force said that they had come across what appeared to be a typical all-American person and father, and that he had come across as a normal married man who had no criminal history, and nobody could have ever looked at Pennell and said that he was capable of doing what he did.
The day after he was arrested, the body of Margaret was found just over 3 months after she had gone missing. Her body was found by a hunter near the Chesapeake, Delaware Canal, and it was so badly decomposed that the exact cause of her death could not be determined, although there were signs of torture on her remains that were similar in nature to the other victims. Her body was so badly decomposed that dental records were the only way that her remains could be identified. And so, we get to the trial. Sometimes this part of the episode is strictly elementary and can be tedious because there's not too much going on, but allow me to say that this case took some twists and turns. Before the trial even began, a panel of defense attorneys argued that the fibers that were taken from Pennell's car were illegally obtained and that they should not be permissible in court. Judge Richard Gibelline dismissed those allegations, however, and said that the carpet was visible to Renee's eyes as soon as she opened the door to the vehicle, and as such, the evidence that was obtained from those fibers was in fact legal. This was incredibly important because, as Pennell's defense attorney would later lay out, if the fibers had been thrown out as evidence in the case, so would a large percentage of the evidence against Pennell because of the poisonous tree doctrine, whereas everything that was discovered after the illegal discovery would also be thrown out.
This trial was actually the first criminal trial in the United States that used DNA evidence as absolute legal evidence, and Judge Gibelline had to set a legal precedent by listening to the opinions of experts and scientists in order to allow it within the case. During the trial, Pennell himself even took the stand to try and defend himself and to try to explain how the DNA evidence could have found its way into his vehicle. In the case of Catherine, he said that he had paid her $25 for oral sex and that he then dropped her off. He then joked that Catherine had given him $10 back, which horrified the jury. Pennell sat on the stand and was joking about his encounter with a woman that he either murdered or who was murdered directly after he had seen her. The jury noticed that he spoke about Catherine as though she was a piece of garbage that he could use and discard of at will. In the closing statements, the prosecution stood right in front of Pennell and said, quote, "Mr. Murr told you in the opening statement in their case, many, many weeks ago, that he stood behind his client. Ladies and gentlemen, I stand in front of him and I say, Stephen Brian Pennell, you murdered Shirley Ellis, you murdered Catherine DeMauro, and you murdered Michelle Gordon. Ladies and gentlemen, please find him guilty." Unquote.
Moore immediately objected to this statement, and he moved for a mistrial on the grounds of prosecutorial misconduct. but the court denied the request for a mistrial and simply struck the statement from the record and instructed the jury to completely disregard the comments when making their decision. The jury would then go into deliberations, and most people believed that they would take 1 to 2 days to go over all of the information and to come to a conclusion. However, that time stretched on, and many people began to wonder if Pennell was not going to be found guilty. The jury deliberated for 8 days, which was the longest ever in the history of Delaware at that point in time. The jury did reach the decision to convict Stephen Pennell of murdering Catherine DeMauro and Shirley Ellis, but Pennell was acquitted of the murder of Michelle Gordon because the jury felt that there was a lack of evidence.
The jury was also deadlocked on the death penalty, and instead they opted for 2 life sentences. There were, of course, appeals in the case, including the obvious appeal stating that the fibers, and thus all the evidence, had been discovered illegally and obtained illegally. This was dismissed by the courts. In point of fact, the courts later stated that they were also indicting Pennell for the murders of Michelle Gordon again and Kathleen Meyer because of new evidence that they had uncovered. Those cases would never go to trial. After those appeals were thrown out, Pennell made the bizarre step of removing his lawyer from the case, and he asked to represent himself again. These moves were approved by the courts. That was not the strangest move that Pennell made, however. He shocked literally everyone when he announced that he wished to receive the death penalty rather than serve 2 life sentences. He said that the entire Constitution was based upon the Bible, and he said that he deserved the death penalty under the laws of the Bible.
He quoted Numbers chapter 35, verse 30, which says, "All murderers must be put to death, but only if evidence is presented by more than one witness. No one may be put to death on the testimony of only one witness." He also quoted Genesis 9:6, which says, "If anyone takes a human life, that person's life will also be taken by human hands." He said that the courts had found him guilty based on the testimony of witnesses, and so he asked that the sentence be death in accordance with the state's laws and with God's laws. In 1991, a psychiatric evaluation was submitted to the Delaware Supreme Court that cleared Stephen of depression, paranoia, and psychosis, and he was described as a pleasant, attractive, and friendly 33-year-old man who related very well when speaking with his examiner.
And so, on October 31st, 1991, the courts officially changed Pennell's sentence to death. Under the Delaware state constitution, every death penalty judgment requires a further hearing with the Supreme Court, and on February 11th, 1992, Pennell appeared before them and demanded that he be sentenced to death. In doing so, he was the only defendant in Delaware history to represent himself before the Supreme Court, and he was the only man convicted of any crime to willingly seek the death penalty. He did, however, continue to plead not guilty in the murders, and he spoke of the murderer in the third person, saying, quote, "The perpetrator must have sensed a pleasure in the killings since he did not commit just one, but continued on the same depraved manner on the others. This pleasure was evident," unquote. It should be noted that the Delaware State Attorney General actually objected to the death penalty, but the judges in the Supreme Court opted to sentence Pennell to death anyways, and his execution was scheduled for March 14th, 1992.
Pennell himself did not file any appeals, but 2 men who he had never even met filed appeals on his behalf. Those 2 appeals were dismissed on lack of standing principles because they had no connection to Pennell or to the case. Vera Catherine Pennell, Stephen's wife, also appealed with help from her local branch of the American Civil Liberties Union and a law professor named Lawrence Hammermesh, who was one of the ACLU directors, argued that Pennell was insane and that he could not fully understand the gravity of his actions, and so he argued that the trial should be reopened and Pennell should be barred from representing himself. The Supreme Court rejected all appeals. Before his execution, many different reporters and media outlets reached out to Pennell in hopes of getting an interview, and more importantly, in hopes of finding out and finding the bombshell of where Kathleen Meyer's body had been discarded. Pennell turned down every request until the execution date was very close. At that point, he decided to do just one interview, and he shockingly chose to have his lawyer again present. And in that interview, Pennell revealed nothing new, and he said nothing about Meyer or where her body could be found.
On March 14th, 1992, at 9:49 a.m., Stephen Pennell was executed by lethal injection, becoming the first person in Delaware in 46 years, and the 165th person to be executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. His last meal was crab cakes, steak, corn on the cob, French fries, bread and butter, and a cola.
Stephen Pennell completely baffles people to this very day, and he's been called everything from a sadistic killer to an enigma. He was never diagnosed with any mental health issues, although it is obviously evident that he must have had some kind of issues going on. Even Eugene Moorer, who was Pennell's attorney, said that the crimes that Pennell committed were completely unspeakable, but that he was never able to connect the Pennell that he knew with the Pennell who committed those murders. Bailey, is there anything else that you want to add to this episode? What were your thoughts when researching this case and discussing this case?
It's really strange to see the similarities between a lot of these serial killers. I know that a lot of people talk about having a specialized MO when it comes to being a serial killer, but it really seems like they kind of also inspire each other. It's really sad.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. You said off the top, like, there's a lot of similarities between this case and obviously the Toolbox Killers case that we covered last time. And it's funny because when we picked this, I wasn't really familiar with the case. I didn't pick it because of similarities, but it's crazy, you know, like, this is again another guy that he worked as an electrician. He had access to tools and he chose to use those tools to cause incredibly sadistic pain and torture to his victims.
It's also crazy to see the exact similarities in how in the autopsies that the women were discovered. He and, like, the Toolbox Killers seem to really have some sort of sadistic hate for women in general. And the only difference that I really spotted between the two cases was the Toolbox Killers had a sexual drive to it. This one didn't. But it still touched on the whole sexual abuse aspect of it by torturing the women with their nipples and hurting their chests and everything like that.
Yeah, it's wild. You know, like you said, the main difference was that, like, whatever Pennell's driving force was, I guess in the end it wasn't physically sexual. He found his sexual stimulation in just the torture. And it's crazy. Like, I mean, when I was researching and seeing everything about his issues with his wife, that's one thing. I mean, that's crazy that he broke her arm and, you know, nothing was reported. Like, we touched on this, but it's heartbreaking that this happens and people don't report these things. But I think that there was obviously a lot with his relationship with his mother. His mom clearly, you know, at least from all the reports that I could find, was always negative on him, was always beating down on him as a child, as an adult. Like, everything he did was never good enough, and she was always coming down hard on him. And I mean, as parents, that's what we do sometimes. So who's to say how hard and what was being said, whether it was cruel or it was just cruel in the mind of Pennell. But in the end, his hatred towards women, you have to wonder if this torture was almost surrogate more towards his mom than it was even sexual. Like, he was just absolutely hated women on some level for some reason. And from everything that I read, that was the only thing that I could find that maybe led to that.
I just want to know what was the flick of the switch that turned him into the serial killer that he was. All of the reports that I read and the research that I did, yes, he did have violent tendencies in the past, especially with his wife, but it didn't show so much aggression to the point where he was going to kill her. She never feared for her life. She may have feared him in general, but I don't recall seeing anywhere that she feared for her life. And for someone who grew up being so nice and being friendly and giving kids rides to school, I really want to know what flicked that switch that just turned it on one day where he woke up and he's like, yeah, today's the day that I am going to act on my emotions.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think of Gacy when I was reading about how he was with children. Here was this guy that, you have to wonder, did he always have two personalities? Was he holding something in reserve for all those years? Or was there literally just a flip of a switch? And all of a sudden, there it was. Had he driven along Route 40 for years and seen street workers along the way and seen hitchhikers along the way and had thoughts, was this something that built up over time, or was it really just one day he got mad at something, at his wife or his mom, or not having a solid job, and he was driving along and he just decided, like, I'm going to take it out on this person, and then from there he just enjoyed it. It was crazy. You look at, again, like, how it sped up. That first murder, and then I think it was 7 or 8 months before the second one, and then all of a sudden, whether it was because he enjoyed it or he realized that the police were closing in, all of a sudden things started happening in quick succession. Once, obviously, this was being reported in the news and talked about, all of a sudden it went from one murder to a serial killer, and I don't know if he acted quickly because he had to on his own level and he thought he wouldn't get caught, or he just decided to do as much damage as he could before he got caught.
But again, the part that also strikes me is, especially towards the end there, going through trial and everything, he consistently maintained that he was innocent and he never killed anyone. But then why would he be so adamant about receiving the death penalty if he wasn't, I guess, trying to hide something? It just seems very strange to me that a man who is innocent wouldn't fight for his life, especially when quoting the Bible. Like, the whole point of the Bible is to forgive as well, so turn the other cheek. I know one of the 10 commandments is thou shalt not murder, but his whole claim was that he was innocent and he never did anything. So don't you think that a religious person would do everything that they can to prove their innocence? He just laid down and took it.
Yep. And that's where the enigma comes in, right? An enigma is someone you just can't understand. And you're right. Like, it's such a weird dichotomy. It's like, you have to wonder, did he just not want to admit that he murdered those women for whatever reason? Or a lot of people believe that in him saying, I should get the death penalty, that was him obviously admitting that he did the murders. But at that point, it's like, why not admit it? I mean, the evidence was certainly there. Like, fibers were found on more bodies when the bodies were found, and his truck was seen, and, it's not a coincidence at one point, but it is weird that he would stand up and just say, like, I didn't commit these murders. I'm innocent of the murders, but because you found me guilty based on what the Bible says, you should murder me. And like you said, at some point, like, do you not, is it self-hatred? What is it? Because in the beginning, he was only sentenced to 2 life sentences, which in the States, obviously, they stack whatever, what have you. But at the end of the day, you have a lawyer. he obviously wasn't entirely unintelligent himself. There are plenty of ways to appeal. And then you even look at the death sentence, and how many times do we look at cases and someone's on death row for decades because right at the last minute they find something to appeal. It gets pushed back. Pennell was put to death on his original death date. There was no appeals that changed it. There was no bump back of date. It was like he accepted it. And I agree with you. He's an enigma. Like, those two things don't work together.
I know that it was mentioned that he had schizophrenia or another form of bipolar, possibly. Is it possible that just the alter ego took over towards the end there when he decided to just be the complete opposite of what he portrayed to everyone else, being this loving family man, being this provider, electrician, a giant teddy bear, the gentle giant in high school? Like, he had all of these positive qualities to him that so many people recognized. But then just towards the end of everything, it seemed almost as if, again, a switch was flicked and he became like the darker version of himself and just continued to spiral in that way. Do you think it's quite possible that even though he was technically medically cleared, and I mean, I don't think the doctors who do the medical clearance on serial killers or even people in prison are qualified at this point, because how many times have we seen serial killers be, quote, medically cleared, unquote, and they just go on to continue what they've done or worse? So is it possible that, like, towards the end, the other personality may have taken over?
I think it's definitely possible. You actually just reminded me of something I wanted to hit on too, is the flip side of that is you look at his history, like you said, he was seen as a gentle giant, but he always wanted to be a police officer. He failed at that. Something drove him to become an electrician. He failed at that. He failed as a bouncer because he wasn't intimidating. Like, I think that whether the mental health struggles were schizophrenia or something like that, like you say, I mean, people can hide those things fairly well. But I also wonder if it was just depression, Obviously, he was married. There's not a lot of information on what his marriage was like outside of some domestic violence. But maybe he just never felt loved and never loved himself. It seems like everything he ever wanted to do, he didn't succeed at. And of course, when you have a mother in the background who's pointing out constantly those failures and pointing out constantly that you basically suck at life, like, that does eventually push you to a breaking point at some point. For some people, that's suicide. For some people, that's self-abuse. And we've seen it so many times. For some people, that's lashing out at other people, whether that's a surrogate to the person that's causing it to you or just a crime of passion, so to speak. Who knows? Like, I don't think, obviously, we're never going to know, but you could talk about it for days and hours and weeks because it's wild. It's wild to see, like you said, the two people or that he was seen as do not correlate.
It's very surprising, which is, again, why I thoroughly enjoyed this episode. And I just want to thank you again for sharing your audience with me and letting me dive into the world of madness and sadness with you.
Hey, you're always welcome. I tell you all the time, I hope you keep coming back to do this because it's a lot of fun to have a co-host. It's a lot of fun to not, like I said last time, talk to just the microphone. I know I've got my listeners, but it's nice to have someone to converse with.
Definitely. And banter with as well.
That's for sure. That's something that I missed on the show for like 100 episodes. Is there anything else you want to add?
I just think that everyone should make better choices.
If only we could all do that. The world would be so much better, wouldn't it?
Yes. Stay safe. Make good choices.
All right. Thank you again, Bailey, for joining me on the show. It's been a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to have you on board. And to you goners out there, thank you to all of you for listening every week to the show. Please support the show on Patreon and by following, sharing, and rating the show as well. I will, of course, see you back here again next week. And in the meantime, please stay safe, stay well, and of course, be better.